Good morning, Divergent Church. So lovely to see you all on this bright Wednesday morning. Please excuse my wet hair. It is early after all. But I love the fact that you're gathering together virtually during lockdown. Of course, us in Sydney, we've been in lockdown now for 8 weeks, so we're experts. I hope you are all coping. Just a thought that has really stayed with me the whole period of this COVID pandemic that God really spoke to me about right at the beginning, and it sustained me all the way through. I remember in the early days of the pandemic and just cancelling everything. Perhaps you've had to cancel plans even this week. A good friend of mine has had to cancel her wedding twice. My mum had to cancel her 80th birthday. My entire itinerary, which included a lovely trip to Switzerland, also got cancelled. And I remember just pondering on this thought, well, what happens to God's plans for the year when the pandemic hit? What happens when plans get cancelled or when plans fail? And the story that came to me is a great story. You may already know it. It's the story of Joseph. And Joseph had heard from God, and he'd received vision of what God's plans for his life were. Even as a young man, God said he would be in leadership, and it would be a position of leadership that was so great that even his older brothers would bow down and submit to his authority. Now, in that culture, if you're the youngest in the family, which Joseph was, that would never happen. So it was a supernatural vision, God's plan for his life. And then, of course, as the story goes, his brothers got very jealous about the vision, and they threw him in a pit and sold him into slavery, and he finds himself in Egypt. And I can just put myself into Joseph's mind thinking, well, what happened to God's plans? They've been sabotaged, they've been cancelled, they've failed. Time goes on, he does the right thing, he serves faithfully in a man called Potiphar's house, and he starts to work his way up the ladder again. The story goes that Potiphar's wife caught his eye, and Joseph caught Potiphar's wife's eye, and she basically betrayed him and accused him of seducing her when it was the other way around. And Potiphar tells this is the story that she tells Potiphar, and Joseph gets thrown into prison. So he's now at the bottom of the rung. He's in an Egyptian prison. Again, wondering what happened to God's plans. They've failed. They've fallen apart. Well, the end of the story is, as you possibly know, that through a set of supernatural circumstances, he ends up getting promoted back into that position. God's plans are fulfilled, and he becomes the second in charge of the greatest empire of the day. He becomes like the prime minister, and suddenly he's catapulted from this lowest position to the highest position, and his brothers and father end up submitting to him in authority, to his leadership. In other words, God's plans come to pass. God is faithful, but the interesting thing about this whole story is that it doesn't happen in a linear direction. It doesn't happen like, here's plan A and it comes about. What we see is that bad things happen. Things get cancelled. His brothers get jealous. Potiphar's wife betrays him. And the thing about it is that God didn't cause these things to happen. He didn't cause his brother's jealousy. It wasn't in God's plan that would happen, that Potiphar's wife would betray him. But what God does is he uses those things to bring his plan to pass. So plan A looks like it fails, but then plan B kicks in, and then plan B looks like it fails, and then plan C kicks in. And this is the nature of God's sovereignty. Romans 8:28 says that God uses everything for good. Even the evil in this world, he takes the bad things, the failure, the cancellation, and he turns it around and he works it into the plan so that it looks like it was like planned for that all along. In fact, Joseph, at the end of his story, he says what the enemy meant for evil, God meant for good. So even in the midst of a pandemic, even in the midst of cancellations and when things go wrong, when plan A fails, we can trust in the God who has the big picture, who can take those negative things, those disappointments, those failures, and we grieve those. You know, it's not nice to be stuck in isolation. It's not nice to be in quarantine. It's awful to lose jobs and to be under threat financially. It's awful to have our holidays cancelled and our hopes destroyed by this global pandemic. But I want to encourage you this morning that God can use those things for good. He can turn plan B into plan A plus. He can take those things, turn them around so that at the end of the story, we'll be able to say what the enemy meant for evil, God meant for good. God weaves his plan even through the cancellations and the failures of our plan. So be encouraged today. God hasn't stopped working. He's still working on your behalf. Even as we sit in lockdown, even as our plans get cancelled, God is still working on our behalf for those who love him and are called according to his purpose. Have a wonderful day.